We were just looking for a quiet weekend away, something to break the monotony of our hectic lives. Between work and bills, Emma and I hardly had any time to ourselves. When we found an old campsite listed online, it seemed perfect, remote, nestled deep in the woods, and with the added bonus of no cell reception. It was exactly what we needed, a weekend to unplug, reconnect, and breathe fresh air. The drive out there was long and winding, the kind of road that makes you feel like you're heading into another world. The trees grew denser the farther we went, until the sunlight barely made it through the canopy. After hours of nothing but twisting roads and the occasional rusted-out car, we finally arrived. The campsite wasn't much, just a clearing with a couple of fire pits, an old wooden sign that had long since lost its lettering, and a trail leading deeper into the forest. It felt off, but I brushed it aside. After all, it was just an old, unused campground. Emma was excited, and her smile convinced me to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. We set up our tent near the edge of the clearing, close to the tree line. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet actually. No birds, no wind rustling through the leaves, just stillness. But again, I ignored it. That was the whole point, right? A peaceful weekend in nature. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we had a fire going. Emma leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder as we watched the flames dance. It was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. "I'm glad we came here," she said softly. Her voice had that dreamy tone to it, like she was already lost in the moment. "Me too," I replied, though I still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at my insides. Something wasn't right, but I didn't want to ruin it for her. It was around midnight when things started to change. The fire was dying down, and the woods around us seemed darker than before. Thick, oppressive. The air felt heavier, as if the entire forest was watching us. I noticed Emma fidgeting, her eyes darting to the shadows at the edge of the campsite. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I strained to listen, but there was only silence. I shook my head. "Hear what?" She swallowed hard, her eyes wide and nervous. "It sounds like singing. Faint, but weird." I didn't hear anything, just the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own breath. But the look on Emma's face unsettled me. "Maybe it's the wind," I offered, though I didn't believe it myself. There was no wind. Emma stood up suddenly, turning toward the darkness. "I think it's coming from over there." I grabbed her arm. "Let's not wander into the woods at night. Probably just your imagination." But before I could say more, a sound broke through the stillness, a low, rhythmic chanting. It was distant, but unmistakable, rising and falling in eerie harmony. My skin crawled as I looked toward the trail that led deeper into the forest. "I don't like this," I muttered, standing up and grabbing the flashlight. "We should leave, pack up, and..." Before I could finish, the chanting grew louder, closer, and then the light of our campfire flickered, dimmed, and died, plunging us into darkness. The air was thick with the smell of something rotten, and that's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the tree line watching us. I could barely make out their shapes in the faint moonlight. They were there, tall, cloaked figures in dark robes, their faces obscured by shadows. "Emma, run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand and yanking her toward the car. We sprinted across the clearing, our footsteps pounding against the earth. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating nothing but trees and darkness. But they were faster. Before we even reached the edge of the campsite, something hit me hard from the side. I was knocked to the ground, the wind driven from my lungs. My flashlight flew out of my hand and shattered on the rocks. I gasped for breath, trying to push myself up, but rough hands grabbed me, dragging me backward into the woods. I screamed for Emma, but my voice was drowned out by the chanting, louder now, all around us. I saw her struggling, kicking and thrashing as they dragged her away too. Her screams echoed through the forest, piercing the night air. We were surrounded. They tied our hands with thick, coarse ropes, dragging us deeper into the woods, far beyond the campsite. The chanting grew louder and more frenzied with every step. My heart pounded in my chest, a sickening rhythm that matched the beat of the chants. Finally, we were thrown to the ground in front of a massive stone altar, slick with something dark and wet. The robed figures gathered in a circle around us, their faces still hidden, their voices rising in unison. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense. Emma was crying, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to reach for her, but my hands were bound too tightly. One of the figures stepped forward, a tall man wearing a mask shaped like an animal's skull. His voice was low, commanding, as he spoke in a language I didn't understand. He raised a long, curved knife, and the chanting reached a fever pitch. "No, please," I shouted, struggling against the ropes. "We didn't do anything. Let us go." The masked man ignored me, his eyes locked on Emma. He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her toward the altar. She screamed, her voice raw with terror. I pulled against my bindings, desperation flooding my veins, but it was useless. They were too strong. I watched in horror as they forced Emma onto the altar, her body shaking with fear. The knife gleamed in the moonlight as the masked man raised it high above her. "No!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Stop!" But the knife came down. The chanting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All I could do was stare at Emma's lifeless body, the blood pooling around her, soaking into the ground. The masked man turned toward me, his eyes cold and empty behind the skull. He raised the knife again, and I knew I was next. As the blade descended, the last thing I heard was the chanting, soft and rhythmic, rising once more into the night. Then, nothing. The hunger of the forest had been fed,